At -17 degrees, the human body stops being a living thing and starts becoming a statue. For 68-year-old Elena, a simple evening walk turned into a death sentence when she slipped down a hidden ravine and broke her hip. Now, her core temperature is dropping into the zone of no return. Her blood is thickening, her breath is a ghost, and her heart is down to 4 beats per minute. She is literally turning to ice. The living hearth, the puppy who thawed a frozen heart. Chapter 1: The Glass Forest. The woods of Michigan's Upper Peninsula are a cathedral of ancient pine and hemlock, but in the dead of winter, they transform into a hostile, airless void. When the mercury drops to -17 degrees, the world becomes a glass forest, a place where the very air is brittle enough to shatter. Every branch is encased in a layer of jagged ice, and the silence is so heavy it feels like a physical weight against the eardrums. Elena, a 68-year-old widow, had lived on the edge of this wilderness for 40 years, but she knew the mountain didn't grant veteran status. She had stepped out for what was supposed to be a 5-minute walk to check the bird feeders before the sun vanished. She was dressed for a stroll, not a siege, unaware that a hidden patch of black ice was waiting like a trap beneath a dusting of fresh powder. The fall was sudden and violent. Her boots lost their grip on the granite ledge, and she plummeted 20 feet into a narrow, stone-walled crevice. The impact was sickening, a sharp crack echoed through the ravine as her hip shattered against the frozen rock. She tried to scream, but the air was so cold it seized her vocal cords, leaving her gasping in a darkness that was rapidly closing in. She was trapped in a natural refrigerator, a lightless trench where the wind couldn't reach, but the cold could pool like water. Elena knew the math of survival better than most. At -17 degrees, a stationary human body loses heat fast. Instincts took over. He recognized the cold death from his nights in the gutter. He lunged at her, not to bite, but to pin her down. He used his 60 pounds of muscle to force her back against the stones, preventing her from shedding the clothes that were her only shield. Toro let out a low, vibrating growl, not of aggression, but of command. He shoved his massive head under her chin, forcing her to look at him. The heat from his breath hit her face like a steam vent, a sudden, violent injection of reality into her frozen hallucination. The paradoxical heat vanished, replaced by the stinging, brutal reality of the -17-degree air. Elena's eyes cleared for a split second. She saw the brown fur, the frosted whiskers, and the desperate intensity in Toro's gaze. She realized then that she wasn't looking at a dog, she was looking at a living battery. Toro knew that he was the only heat source left in the world, and he was prepared to spend every calorie he had to keep her heart from stopping. Chapter 3: The Heat Seeker. Toro began a process that biologists call conspecific thermoregulation, but for the puppy, it was simply an act of war. He draped his long, muscular body directly over Elena's chest and neck, covering her most vital arteries. He tucked his muzzle into the crook of her neck, his nostrils venting hot air directly into her parka. He was a living hearth, a biological shield against the void. To generate heat, Toro began to shiver, a high-intensity muscular vibration that is the animal kingdom's equivalent of a furnace. His entire frame pulsed with energy, his muscles burning through his fat reserves at an incredible rate. He was intentionally driving his own metabolism into the red zone, turning himself into a radiator that pumped 101-degree heat into Elena's 88-degree core. Every few minutes, Toro would use his rough, sandpaper tongue to lick Elena's eyelids and cheeks. The friction served two purposes: it prevented the moisture in her eyes from freezing shut, and the physical slaps of the tongue kept her blood from pooling and clotting in her facial capillaries. He was performing the work of a team of nurses with nothing but his tongue and his heartbeat. The cold was relentless, a physical entity trying to pry the two apart. The stone walls of the ravine acted like a heat sink, trying to draw the warmth out of Toro's underside. He shifted his weight, pulling Elena's frozen hands and tucking them under his belly, against the thinnest skin where his heat was most accessible. He was literally donating his life force to her, 1 degree at a time. As the night wore on, Toro's own temperature began to drop. He was losing the battle against the -17-degree air, his ears becoming tipped with frost and his breathing becoming a heavy, labored rasp. But he refused to move. He was a Mastiff-mix, a breed built for protection and endurance, and his loyalty was a terminal condition. He had decided that if Elena was going to turn to ice, he would freeze with her. The wind howled above the ravine, a predatory sound that seemed to mock the tiny pocket of warmth at the bottom of the trench. But the warmth was holding. Beneath the heavy weight of the puppy, Elena's heart began to stabilize. The golden hour had passed, but the diamond knight was being held at bay by 60 pounds of stubborn, brown fur and a heart that refused to stop beating. Elena was no longer conscious in the traditional sense, but she was no longer in the zone of no return. She was in a deep, protective coma, her brain sensing the steady, rhythmic vibration of the dog on top of her. In her dreams, she wasn't in a frozen ravine, she was sitting by a fireplace, the warmth of the flames wrapping around her like a blanket. Toro was the fire. High above, the stars began to fade into the grey-purple of pre-dawn. The mountain had thrown everything it had at the pair: the wind, the ice, and a cold so deep it could crack stone. But the mountain hadn't counted on the death of a stray. The puppy who had been saved from the rain was now the only reason the woman was still breathing in the snow. Chapter 4: The War of Temperatures. When the first light of dawn finally hit the glass forest, the search and rescue teams moved out with grim faces. They expected to find a frozen scene, a static, tragic tableau of a life ended by the elements. They moved slowly through the deep powder, their thermal drone scanning the white expanse for any sign of a heat signature. For hours, they found nothing but the cold, blue silence of the trees. Suddenly, the lead technician on the drone team gasped. "I've got a hit." "It's faint, it's deep in that ravine near the ridge." He pointed to a small, flickering orange dot on the screen. It wasn't the bright, vibrant glow of a healthy human, it was a dim, pulsing ember of heat, huddled against the stones. "There's no way," the captain whispered. "No one survives 10 hours at -17. They reached the edge of the ravine and looked down. What they saw was a sight that would be retold in rescue stations for decades. They didn't see a body, they saw a mound of frost-covered fur. Toro was completely encased in a layer of rime ice, his whiskers frozen into needles and his body curled in a tight, protective arc. He looked like a statue, but as the light hit him, he let out a low, pained whimper. He didn't move as the rescuers slid down the embankment. He didn't even wag his tail. He stayed pinned to Elena's chest, guarding the heat he had spent the last 10 hours creating. When a paramedic reached out to check Elena's pulse, Toro gave a weak, warning snap of his jaws. Even at the brink of death, his mission hadn't changed. He was the guardian of the hearth, and he wasn't finished. "She's alive," the paramedic shouted, his voice cracking with disbelief. "She's cold as a stone, but her heart is beating." The dog kept her core warm. They had to gently pry Toro away from her, his muscles so locked by the cold and the effort of shivering that he couldn't stand on his own. He watched with glazed eyes as they loaded Elena into a vacuum-sealed thermal bag. As the medevac helicopter hovered over the trees, the wind from the rotors whipped the snow into a frenzy. Toro was wrapped in his own heated blankets, his body finally beginning to relax as the external warmth took over. He watched the orange sled containing Elena being hoisted into the sky. He had held the line. He had outlasted the mountain. The flight to the regional trauma center was a race against a different kind of clock. The doctors were worried about afterdrop, a phenomenon where the cold blood from the limbs rushes back to the heart during the thawing process, causing it to stop. They kept Elena's body at a precise, gradual warm-up, but they knew that the only reason they had a patient to treat was the dog in the snow. In the hospital, the nurses called her the Ice Queen, but they said it with a sense of awe. Her core temperature had been 82 degrees upon arrival, a temperature usually associated with death. But the concentrated heat Toro had provided to her neck and chest had protected her brain. The living hearth had done what no machine could, it had provided a targeted, biological survival system. Chapter 5: The Thaw. Elena's recovery was a slow, painful process of the body restarting. As the ice melted from her life, she had to endure the agonizing pins and needles of her nerves coming back online. She spent 3 days in a medically induced haze, her mind still caught between the ravine and the fireplace. But every time she drifted near the edge, she felt a phantom weight on her chest, a memory of warmth. When she finally opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was the sterile, white ceiling of the ICU. Her daughter was there, crying and holding her hand. "You're safe, Mom," she whispered. "You're safe." Elena's voice was a ghost of its former self, a dry rasp that barely carried across the room. She didn't ask where she was. She didn't ask about her hip. She only asked one word: Toro. The hospital had a strict no pets policy, but for the miracle of the ravine, they made an exception. The local news had picked up the story, and the entire state was waiting to see if the puppy had survived his own sacrifice. Toro had suffered severe frostbite on his paws and ears, but his mastiff heart had proven to be as resilient as the mountain itself. On the fourth day, the double doors of the ICU swung open. A nurse led a limping, bandaged puppy into the room. Toro's ears were wrapped in gauze, and his paws were in little blue booties to protect his healing skin. But the moment he smelled Elena, the exhaustion vanished. He let out a sharp, joyful bark and tried to leap onto the bed, his tail thumping against the metal rails like a drum. The reunion was a moment of profound, silent understanding. Toro rested his head on Elena's lap, his amber eyes searching hers. He didn't need to be told she was okay, he could hear her heart. He could hear the steady, rhythmic thump-thump that he had spent 10 hours fighting for. He let out a long, contented sigh and closed his eyes, finally allowing himself to sleep. The doctors noted that during Toro's visit, Elena's blood pressure stabilized and her pain levels dropped significantly. It was as if the two of them had a shared nervous system, a bond forged in the sub-zero dark that was now healing them both. The woman had rescued the dog from a gutter, and the dog had rescued the woman from the grave. The circle was complete. The story of the living hearth went viral, touching hearts in every corner of the globe. It became a reminder that in our high-tech world of sensors and satellites, there is no substitute for the raw, unyielding power of animal devotion. A puppy doesn't calculate the odds, he doesn't check the protocol. He simply stays until the job is done or the heart stops. Elena eventually returned to her cabin, though she never walked the woods alone at night again. She and Toro became a common sight in the local park, a woman with a slight limp and a large, protective dog with notched, frost-scarred ears. They were a living testament to the fact that even at -17 degrees, the world isn't entirely cold as long as you have someone to share your heat with. Chapter 6: The Heart Never Freezes. The glass forest still stands behind Elena's house, and the winters in the Upper Peninsula are just as brutal as they've always been. But the silence of the woods no longer feels like a threat. She wants people to understand that when you rescue an animal, you aren't just performing an act of charity. You are building a fortress. You are investing in a guardian who will watch over you when the lights go out and the world turns cold. You are creating a bond that can bridge the gap between -17 degrees and the warmth of a living home. Toro is older now, a massive, greying mastiff who takes his job as Elena's shadow very seriously. He still sleeps at the foot of her bed, his head resting on her feet. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he'll let out a soft, rhythmic shiver in his sleep, a memory of the ravine that never quite fades. Elena will reach down and pet his scarred ears, a silent thank you that passes between them. The story of the living hearth is a lesson for anyone facing their own frozen night. It tells us that no matter how deep the ravine or how cold the wind, hope is a biological reality. It tells us that the strongest force in nature isn't the frost or the storm, it's the heat generated by a soul that refuses to leave its pack behind. As the snow falls outside your window tonight, think of the protectors in your own life. Think of the ones who would shiver so that you could be warm. We tell these stories so that the Toros of the world are never forgotten, and so that we remember to be the kind of people who are worth saving when the mountain comes calling. The heart never truly freezes as long as it has someone to beat for. Elena and Toro are proof of that, two souls who walked through the fire of the frost and came out unbreakable. They are the guardians of the hearth, a woman and her dog, living their lives one warm, grateful heartbeat at a time. If Toro's sacrifice reminded you that animals are our greatest warmth, don't let his legend end here. Help us share the light of his story with those who need to believe in miracles. Because in the end, it's not the height of our mountains that defines us, but the depth of the love we find at the bottom of the ravine. The mountain is cold, but love is a furnace. If Toro's journey touched your soul, help us honor the guardian who outlasted the frost. Smash that like button to salute Toro and every rescue animal that became a savior. Subscribe to Paws that saved lives, where we bring you the most thrilling and dramatic cinematic legends of nature's heroes. Comment Toro below if you believe a dog's love is the strongest force in the world.